Hi, this is Joe Makuc, uh, here in the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society McLean Library at 100 North 20th Street. Today's date is June 20th?
22nd.
22nd. Thank you. That is Mindy Maslin, who I'm speaking with today on behalf of the Pennsylvania uh, Horticultural Society led Cultivating Community Gardens Histories Project, or the Community Garden Memory Project. And Mindy, today will be talking a bit more about her experience working with the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society in the past roughly 30 years on tree tenders, the tree tenders program. So before we get into all that, Mindy, though, I want to ask you a little bit more about your background, if that's okay. So where did you grow up, and did you or your neighbors have gardens there?
I grew up in Lafayette Hill in Pennsylvania, in the suburbs.
Of
We-
Philadelphia?
Yeah,
Okay.
suburbs of Philadelphia.
Mhm.
We didn't have a vegetable garden, but we did have a property with trees planted and some shrubs. It went down to a woods that we used to explore when I was a child, and early on with our big collie, and so I grew up. I grew up with trees. I planted trees with my dad. I grew up weeding, and, and I hated weeding, of course, as a child, but now as an adult, I find it meditative. I think that's the case with many people. So I left Lafayette Hill pretty early on. And I spent a year in Israel after high school on a kibbutz, and then went to Temple for a year, and then did Vista. I was a Vista volunteer in Iowa,
Mhm.
and did tenant organizing, which sparked my interest for studying social work, which I did when I came back.
Mhm.
But I did it part-time as an evening student. I had a job working with Big Brothers Big Sisters as a social worker, and managing a caseload, and had a little sister at the time who I still am in touch with, and so I was working at Big Brothers Big Sisters when I heard about the job here at PHS.
Mhm.
And I was on the board of directors of the Clean Air Council, and was trying to get them to offer trees as an incentive for people joining the Clean Air Council. And from that, I met some people at PHS, and when a job opening happened in the tree program, I applied for it and didn't get it. And unfortunately, the person who did get it didn't last very long, and they called me back and said, "Won't you please reconsider?" So I did, and I was hired to do youth programming.
Okay. And that was 1991?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a very similar story in some ways to Sally McCabe's, I'm reminded of, who also who also got her start in urban agriculture, not at PHS, but with
Urban gardening.
yes, yes, yes. But the urban gardening extension. Um, Also getting rejected and then coming in when the person failed to do the work. Yeah, but I mean that's just a side note. But I wanted to, I guess, back it up a little bit though, and dig deeper into your first memories of gardening, if that's okay. Because I don't, I don't know. I think the weeding experience is one that I've heard a lot of gardeners talk about, learning to weed with their parents. But planting trees is big. You said that your dad kind of taught you how to garden and to plant trees. Is that right?
I planted trees with my dad. Yeah.
Right.
I tell you the truth is that when I was born an environmentalist. You can get into trees either from one of two sides, from horticulture or from environmentalism, and I definitely entered through environmentalism.
Yeah.
I mean, even as a child, I would I just felt it was wrong to use things once. I was totally into recycling before it was big.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so that was it wasn't so much gardening history that brought me in as much as a love of nature and kind of an empathy for nature and how it's so much at our at our disposal, how it's dealt with, and
Right.
so wanting to be on the proactive side of protecting nature and protecting the planet, and planting trees was a natural way to go with that.
Yeah, it strikes me that you mentioned growing up in the suburbs with like this woods in your backyard. That's like a very, I feel like in that kind of scenario you can very easily either go, well, these are woods to use, or these are woods to
Yeah.
cultivate and protect and steward. But yeah.
Yeah.
So you mentioned starting at PHS in 1991, and so there, you come to PHS in 1991. Your initial position is not to do with tree tenders, because you haven't started tree tenders yet, but it is education, right? Education based.
Mm-hmm.
So what roles did you play at PHS at that time in that position?
Yeah, so I was hired to do youth education about
Mhm.
trees, and there wasn't a lot of direction on that, and so the first thing I realized I had to do was build some sort of database of interested teachers,
Mhm.
and knowing enough about teachers to know that they're always trying to get stuff for their kids. I put something out that a survey for what kind of interest they might have in about trees and the environment. And I said that for the first 100 responders would get seeds, packets of seeds, which PHS has like in boxes all over the place at that time anyway. And so I got my goodness, it was definitely maybe close to 100 responses from people that filled out this survey form saying what kind of programs they would want for their kids, and that way I got names and addresses, and we didn't have emails back then, but we had phone numbers, and that was the start. And then I went through the union, the teachers union, and asked them if they would send this out to through their, I think it was called the Pony Express was the and so they sent it out, and I got all these responses, and at the same time, simultaneously, I was looking for some kind of program to do, and developed this game called Environmental Jeopardy. That's a big board game that we would do assemblies with, but I wanted to catch the attention of the kids, and I was looking for this kind of some kind of a catch to get people's attention. And at the same time, I happened to go to an anti-McDonald's rally. Now, mind you, this is in the early 90s, and there was a rapper there, this guy Monty G, who was doing this anti-McDonald's rap. So I hired him. I hired him to write a tree rap and go off to the schools with me and do this tree rap, and then I do this assembly program, Environmental Jeopardy, and I sent out study questions ahead of time so that it was kind of a multi-phase thing, and it was great. It was very successful. At one point I even had a buzzer system. Oh, and suppose my husband loves to tell the story of how I even got permission from Jeopardy to
Wow. That's very cool. That's yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it was Alex Trebek then.
Yeah.
But yeah, wow.
Yeah, so that was really funny.
Okay, well, yeah, continue.
Yeah, so we had all these teachers that we started working with. We did some really cool things. We did tree labs where we would set up these raised beds and grow container trees for a couple years at the schools, and then plant them in the around the schools, either on the school property or in the surrounding neighborhood. So we did that for a few years and a couple years, and it's but I was only doing this work for about a year when I went to a conference and heard this woman, Lynn Westfall, who became a friend, from Chicago's Tree Keepers program. And she was talking about their citizen forestry program, about their citizen stewardship program, and how they trained people that would then, help to take care of the trees in Chicago. And it was just this light bulb. And I thought, this is what Philly needs. Of course, what we designed in Philly was much more Philly-centric, so it was very neighborhood-based. And it is very neighborhood-based still. But it was based on that program and on Trees New York, which I went and visited, and on a program in Baltimore, Tremendous Maryland. And using those, and then kind of using my social work background skills, we designed a program that was decentralized, also because we had no staff. I wasn't even paid to do this work, and there was nobody else. And so I had to have a decentralized program where the onus was on the community to do the actual work, and we would just provide the resources. And that's how it started.
So the work you were getting paid for was the working with schools and the tree wrap, which I would love to hear.
Oh my God, I'd love to find it. Hey everybody in the place to be, listen up, cause it's me. Yes, it's Monty G, and I'm here to tell you about the good things in life, about making things beautiful and keeping things bright. And I'm here talking about trees. That's right, trees. And I don't remember anymore.
Well, that's already that's more than I expected, honestly. But
I heard it a lot of times.
Yes. And then so the container trees, school trees, all that was your purview because of your youth education position, but the tree tenders itself, as it would come to be known, grew out of these more national conversations about trees in cities.
When I heard Lynn speak, I realized that that's what Philly needed. And then I wanted to just research some of the kind of close-in groups to see how they were managing their programs. And we actually used the textbook from Trees New York for a couple years until we developed our own. And but it was what I needed to get from them was ideas on curriculum and what some of the kind of the potholes were to avoid, but most of the programs around the country, they train people, and then they plan an event and call people to come to this location and help with the event, right? What I was doing was training people and then saying, go into your neighborhood and figure out how we can help you with a project. And so they would identify something that had to happen in their own community.
Yeah. And
they would plan it, and they would recruit the volunteers. And they would contact the tool libraries that we set up and ask for whatever resources they needed. If they needed extra experts on site, if they needed a training program for their folks, if they, whatever they needed. And then we would support them. So it was way different, but the impact of it was so much greater because we weren't just planting trees, but we were building community.
Right. So you mentioned that you were doing this education. You're setting up tool libraries for neighborhoods and for regions, whatnot. How do and you're doing this as volunteer work to start. How do you, Yeah,
it wasn't just, PHS knew what I was doing. And it wasn't like I was, hiding it. I'm not saying it in that, I thought that you were insinuating that, but
Right.
more that while the funding sources didn't change at first, I was allowed to kind of venture into these other areas, and for things where there were expenses, then allowances were made.
So you're using PHS resources for it's more volunteer in the sense that you're kind of volunteering yourself for it, though it's not part of the job description.
Right.
Right.
I had to keep up the kid programming.
Right. And who were you working with most closely to like help out to like produce these tool libraries and connect with neighborhoods?
I mean, a lot of it was PHS has a big network. So, and we had the Green Country Towns back
Right.
then were very active. Sally had a lot of gardeners. I put the word out, PSAs, just through neighborhood civic groups, and somehow the word got out, and even to this day, I've been doing the same program. Now it's 3 times a year. It's an 8-hour program over the course of 4 weeks. And I've been doing it for, so three times a year for 30 years. It's like it'll hit 100 at some point, times that I've done this training. And people keep coming.
Yeah.
We have, we had 100 people signed up for the last class.
Yeah.
And now it's regional, which is a whole new population. But over half the people still come from Philly. And it's all word of mouth at this point. I mean, there are target neighborhoods. We've identified neighborhoods that are high need, that have low canopy, high population, high crime, areas that have low income. So some of the neighborhoods that are the highest needs in this city haven't traditionally come out and said, yeah, I want to be a tree tender. I mean, some of them have. West Philly was always real big, but parts of North Philly, some of the Hispanic neighborhoods weren't involved. We had Norris Square a long time ago in the beginning, but that kind of faded away. And so we started putting more emphasis into those neighborhoods, into recruiting from those neighborhoods, and working with local churches, working with whatever the civic association or the community development corporation, in the neighborhood was. So yeah, we now are more conscious of where we're getting people from, and not only that, but who we get from the neighborhoods. So it could be, the example that everyone always gives is Point Breeze, and Point Breeze is traditionally, a lower income African American neighborhood, but there's a lot of young white people moving in there. And there have been lots of debates over things like building up, having higher buildings, and where the traditional buildings were only two stories, maybe 3,
Right.
and having people build, and then there's issues with trees, and so some people are afraid that trees bring gentrification, and and you can't say no that they don't if people, because it's people's experience, and
Right.
every experience has to be honored, and there is some validity in that if it's not if it's not the local people that are really pushing for the change, who's pushing for it, and who are the tree tender leaders that are, are they representative of the community, of the majority of the community. And so one of our groups is in Grace Ferry, and Grace Ferry and Point Breeze are right next to each other, and there's a group, Philly Thrive, that's a that's been active in a lot of political issues, environmental issues in the Southwest. And they're involved with tree tenders, and that's exactly the kind of thing that we're hoping for. But we know we can't just hope. We have to be out there and working to develop the relationships in the community so that people see that the trees are not just a nicety. You know, that this means public health. This means your kids' ability to pay attention better in school if they have exposure to nature. It means, you know, a decrease in asthma rates. It's a decrease in the heat island effect. It can be 20 degrees cooler in some neighborhoods than others within a 5-mile zone. Okay.
Yeah, no, that's good. It's good. I wanted to, because one of the things I did want to kind of go back and ask about more is that, like, how, I mean, because you mentioned environmentalism. You go through all these roles of organizing tenants and voters and Big Brother, Big Sister, and like all the social work stuff, or you know, organizing people, and you come to organizing trees, and it's like, in some ways, almost an entirely different topic, but in another way, you're focusing on trees for the social services they provide and how they help communities and, you know, human and non-human.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it is tree social work.
Yeah.
And it is working with humans, but it's also it's helping humans to look differently at their environment. I mean, there's plant blindness that, you know, people talk about, but there's tree blindness that's definitely a big part of that. One of the complaints that I always kid my new classes, my new tree tenders about is, you know, I tell them at the end of the first class that the main complaint people have is that they're no longer able to walk down the street in peace. And that's the sign of success, that people are now walking down the street and they're seeing that tree, they're looking at the pit, they're seeing, is there a root flare there, are there things that are strangling it, are there girdling roots, or, you know, what's the dieback in the branches, and, you know, creating people that see this is increasing their awareness of, I guess, the individuality of the uniqueness of every tree, and that helps to increase their awareness of how the planet is alive.
Like you're a language professor and you're teaching them how to, like, you know, recognize.
Yeah, the 42 words for snow.
Yeah. I guess I wanted to ask, though, speaking of classes, if you could think back to that very first class, like, what was, I mean, what do you remember in terms of, I don't know, I know for you'd already obviously done a lot of education, but what was the sensory experiences like? You know, where was it physically? What were the sounds and sights and smells of that environment? What trees were you working with in particular, if you remember?
I honestly, in the very beginning, I kept it a secret to everyone, including Sally, who held my hand through the whole thing. And I didn't know the difference between a maple and an oak.
That's good, because I also wanted to maybe at some point double back and ask about, you know, the trees you planted when you were growing up, but.
A weeping willow.
Oh,
planted.
Nice.
Yeah, I believe it was at the PHS office. So we had, back then we were on Walnut Street and Chestnut Street. So my office was in Chestnut Street, and then the show's office, those people were on Walnut Street. And that was a National Park Service building. And so I believe the first class we had it in there. And almost positive. I keep thinking also we rented used the visitor center for a couple, you know, some classes later on. But this one was at the PHS office.
Right.
And and I had Julianne Schieffer, who's with Penn State Extension, and she was new with Extension, and we started about the same time. We went to a conference together and became like the closest friends. And so she was there helping to teach it because I couldn't teach it,
Yeah.
right? I didn't know anything. And Hal Rosner, who is an arborist, he was with Bartlett back then. He's now with the Sheckman Trees, but he used to work at PHS, and the two of them helped me put together the curriculum. And so they were both there helping to teach the class, and it was such a, I mean, some of those people, there's a guy, Tom Lederer, who's now passed, but he was in the class, and he was this Kensington guy. It was like a total Kensington guy, very, very family centric, very involved in his community, very working class in his way, and he was so enthusiastic and such a, there were people in the class that just stole my heart and made me know that this would work. There were two people from what's that neighborhood? Liberty Land, Northern Liberties.
Yes.
There was a couple from Northern Liberties, and they were in that class, and it was a nice sized class. Carla Pepin, who's still involved.
She was at the first one.
I believe she was in the first one. I believe so. It's like, so much as it is like, that was half my life ago.
Yeah. Yeah. Because now, I mean, well, you continue. You have more recollections.
Yeah. So it was lively. It was, there was a lot of laughter. There was a lot of interest. There were people were so excited to be given this opportunity, and that's what we know is that if people are given the opportunity to do something good, they will. And so we just provided the opportunity, the training. Later on, it wasn't until much later on that we started providing the concrete cuts and the trees. In the beginning, they had to. I mean, in the beginning, it was tree tenders. It wasn't tree planters.
Yes.
But that only lasted a couple of years, and everybody wanted to plant trees, so that changed.
Just a couple of years, like would you say like mid '90s was when you started planting trees?
I think so. I think it was about that.
Okay.
Yeah, and we started planting trees. It was Baldwin burlap trees. We did I think we did bare root for a little while from Princeton Nurseries had a bare root warehouse, and so we got some bare root trees from them and planted them. But people were responsible for removing their own concrete. They wanted to plant on the street. They had to. I mean, there were groups that went out and rented concrete saws, and then hauled it away. We gave permission, and they just did whatever it took. Yeah. So then after that nursery, that dried up. That nursery closed, and we for a while did Baldwin burlap trees, which means renting, heavy equipment to move these things around, and groups still did that. And what was funny was that the first maybe 10 years that we were around, we were under the radar of Parks and Rec, and so we didn't have to get permits. It's not that they didn't know we existed, because I talked to, I guess the director back then was, it was Jim Donaghy, and they knew what we were doing, and at one point they said, well, what we need you to do is just send us a list after you plant of what you planted and where you put it. Said, okay, we can do that. And then at one point, I guess they they recognized that we had another program that was doing street tree planting, and at PHS, that was more with contractors, and it came up that they had to get permits and we didn't, and instead of it going their way, that they did. Yeah, so that was the end of our heyday. But getting permits from the city means more of a collaboration with them, so that's turned out in the long run to everyone's benefit.
Yeah. Okay. I guess so. What I wanted to ask is, so you're working with Julian.
Schiefer.
You're working with Hal Rosner. At what point do you really start?
Transitioning?
Yes, into becoming your own tree expert.
Oh, well, I don't know.
That may not be the best way to word that question.
Yeah.
Is there a memory you have where it was like something clicked for you, or was there I don't know, when was the first time you remember being
knowing
I know what's up with that tree?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we wrote a book. We wrote the Tree Tender Handbook.
And that was in like the first few years, I assume.
That was like maybe 4 or 5 years in. Yeah. And again, my sense of time is non-existent, and I have no sense of time. But it was something like that, and so writing that manual was, and we had a newsletter. We had the Tribune, the Philadelphia Tribune, and so that we wrote articles for and had that came out like once a month, and I think maybe it was quarterly. Maybe the majority of the time it was quarterly, but I, at that point I learned quickly. Yeah, that it was a big learning curve, and I had to rise to it, and I had a younger brain.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, and you were redoing a lot of reading. You were working with a bunch of arborists. Yeah, but
and going to conferences. There were we had a really robust relationship with Penn State at that point, and with Morris Arboretum, and we just spent a lot of time learning. A lot of conferences, a lot of meetings. Bob Gutowski was the the head of urban forestry then, and I guess Jason Lubar is now, and they've all been very close friends.
When you say we spent a lot of time learning, do you mean you, Julian, and Hal?
No, Julian and Hal knew their stuff.
Okay.
So we was the royal we. I spent a lot of time learning.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
Speaking of we spending a lot of time, you have this photo here from the PHS archives. It's digitized online in the Philadelphia Power Library, and I believe it's from 1992. And I believe it's showing. I'm guessing this is you.
Yeah.
Yeah, you in the background with in the back with a floral shirt, looking up as somebody, overseeing it looks like a pruning operation to me, like an oak, I'm guessing. It might.
Looks more like a maple.
Oh, that makes that would make more sense actually. This is why I'm not the tree expert. But yeah, do you remember anything about circumstances of this?
It was a tree tender class, and each of the classes had an outside component, a hands-on component. So the first class we looked for urban stresses on trees. The second class we did a planting, and the third class we did actual tree care. So this would have been a third class. And I don't remember him.
The person in the pink shirt.
Yeah. But I was happy with that cut. Yeah, I'm wondering this. It looks like it might be by the is. Oh, I know where it is. This is the first bank, the first
Oh, the first bank
on
in
3rd Street.
yes.
Yeah, so this would have been back then because that's
Oh,
our old
wow.
that's where our old neighborhood was.
Right. You were at Walnut and Chestnut, as you said. Yeah.
Third M, yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Wow. So that's yeah. In multiple ways, this is a very '90s picture.
Yeah.
But cool.
My lounge lizard shirt.
You're wait, lizard?
Lounge lizard.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, it's cool. It's like floral pattern shirts. I don't know, very cool, very fitting, I think, for PHS.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
but yeah, yeah. So thank you for giving kind of that expose and contextualizing this photo a little, and identifying the maple. But so the basics of tree tenders that you're developing, like your basic knowledge of urban tree planting, like planting like 30 feet from corners at the time is something I think you brought up in the Plant a Trillion Trees podcast. Excuse me, in the first episode. Yeah, that comes from like the conference work that the conference learning that you're doing, reading the textbook from Trees New York, etc., etc.
You're writing our own textbook.
Right. As
Yeah.
it was that couple years in, like the 4 or 5 years in. Yeah. I wanna. I guess my follow up to that is, so you're learning this stuff, you're doing all this work, just focusing on tree tending, like tree maintenance, and then as you just enumerated, kind of also developing into tree planting. At the same time this happening, how does your role within PHS change over as you're developing this?
Well, the first year I was there, I worked with I had one supervisor, and was able to switch. I don't know if this ever would have started if I hadn't switched to working with Patricia Schreiber. Have you talked to Patricia?
No, I don't think I have.
She was an old timer. She's retired now, but she's definitely worth talking to.
Okay.
And even though she's retired and older than me, her memory is probably much better. And she's wonderful. So I worked with her. She was my supervisor, and she just allowed all kinds of freedom. And so that, I guess that was a huge change at PHS. But I also, at one point, we hired somebody else to do youth programming, and we developed this was later on, and we developed a tree tender teachers program, and so a training program to teach teachers how to teach kids about trees. And we have a whole curriculum that Janet put on a LibGuide, made a LibGuide for, and yeah, so that's still around. The program was successful. We had a lot of people come through. They seemed to appreciate it. But over and over again, we kept getting requests for people wanted to learn more about gardening. They were happy to learn about trees, but they really wanted to learn about gardening. And that was how garden tenders or Green City Teachers came around. So the Tree Tenders Teachers program eventually kind of faded off, and the Green City Teachers program took off.
Wow. And
Garden Tenders was based on Tree Tenders too.
Yes.
And so
important. So basically, you kind of provide the prototype, and not just the prototype, but a functioning model that then kind of becomes what a template for other PHS programming. Um,
Yeah, for that, and then in a way also the rain check program, and but which was much more loosely.
mhm.
But we also had an opportunity through a number of different sources. The biggest was Keep America Beautiful, to take this model to other cities. And so we worked with them for a couple years, maybe a few years, and did trainings in Florida and in where was that? Detroit and Texas.
Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Virginia.
Wow. That's very cool. Um, yeah, I'm just thinking that like Detroit is one of the first cities to have like a vacant lot gardening program in the city. So it's interesting to see like people from Philly come around and do education there.
Huh. How do you know that?
I did my thesis on community garden history.
Oh my gosh.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
From where are you?
I went to Temple.
Yeah.
Yeah. For the history program.
Oh my
So yeah,
gosh.
yeah. So that's my passion. So I'm sorry if I'm being a little self-indulgent, I think.
No,
but
no, I love it. I love it.
yeah. But I guess what I'm hearing is as kind of PHS is starting to bring on these other staff, like another youth educator and whatnot, and as to start working with Patricia Schreiber, and as PHS kind of recognizes like that this could be a model for other programs, spawning kind of like everything from garden tenders, very obviously influenced to Green City teachers, kind of growing out of the work that you're doing with teachers, and rain check more loosely. You kind of start to get more. Your job kind of starts to fall mostly on tree tenders more than on the going to schools, having the great rap come out, and yeah.
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 Monty.
Yes.
Monty G.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's something else I was going to mention to you about all that. It just flipped out of my brain. Who I worked with, oh yeah. No, one thing I hadn't mentioned that kind of fits into the whole thing is PHS now considers itself environmental organization. When I applied for the job here, I had an interview with Blaine Bonham, who was then the director of Philadelphia Green, and he said directly to me, said, well, PHS is not an environmental group. We're a horticultural society, a horticultural program. And I said, well, if you hire me, you'll be getting an environmentalist, not a horticulturalist. And he took the chance on it. And in 30 years, it's I like to think that this has been, that I've been part of that process of it changing its view of itself.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very interesting. Also, speaking of Philadelphia Green, because that's also like one of the things that I think of when I think of Point Pre's, and PHS's work there. And
Mamie Nichols.
yeah, in many of the areas of the city, like Norris Square that you talked about, in the green country towns, and the tree training that you have done, like, is kind of in tandem, and in some extent, or kind of, it feels like it dovetails very neatly to me with the history of Philadelphia Green and the the attempts to bring greening to more neighborhoods.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely fits in that. And the Green Country Town model was one of that really did depend on the community organizing itself. And so it did fit really well in with that.
Yeah. You weren't working that dissimilarly from, in some ways, from someone like Eileen Gallagher.
Mm-mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Um, okay. I want to skip ahead a little bit because I think we've kind of outlined how you transitioned from being a youth educator at PHS to starting this tree tenders to then getting your job shifting into more of just a tree tenders focus. Um, I wanted to skip ahead a little bit to, I believe, 20 the past couple years you've been working with some scholars from Temple University and also somebody from the USDA Forest Service, um, Elizabeth Reedman, Hamel Pearsall, Laura A. Roman, who I believe is from the USDA Forest Service.
Mm-hmm.
The first few.
Yeah, the field station here.
Yes, 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 yes. And then
Tim Eiffel.
Yeah, Tim Eiffel, and Dana Dentis.
Dentis. Yeah.
Yes. And so.
And Jahan Samaha, and Jahan
Yes.
Jehane.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes.
And Ashley Davis. They make up the team.
Right, right, right.
It's me and Dana and Tim, Ashley, Jahan.
Right, the tree team, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And Barley on demand.
On demand.
She's retired, but
Oh, okay.
but she comes back when we call.
Per diem.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I was. Yeah. So obviously, like the tree focus at PHS has no shortage of resources. But what I want to focus on, especially with these Temple University scholars, and with Roman from the USDA Forest Service outpost here, is that you recently were listed as co-author on an article in Urban Forestry Community titled "Why Don't People Plant Trees?"
Yeah, that was very generous of her.
Well, I mean, I would just so you know, I did just talk with Liz last
Mm-hmm.
week, and she was very. I mean, it seemed it. I feel like she felt much the same to working with you.
Yeah.
So, but just I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about that and how you got involved with that research, and what your role with.
Well, yeah. So
yeah.
just Hamel and Liz and Laura, they all came to us and said, this is something that we want to do, and we said, yeah, this would be great. This would be great to have more concrete information on the barriers to tree planting. I mean, so much of it is, we think we know why people don't like trees,
Right.
but to have it documented would be really helpful. And also helpful in kind of working with other people and in education. I mean, we started years ago. When people would say, "Oh, I don't want a tree because it'll get into my pipes," our response was, "No, it won't. That the tree roots grow in the top 24 inches of the soil. The pipes are 6 feet down. Why would they go there? Unless your pipe already has a leak." And then the trees will go down and exasperate it. Now we know better that if somebody says something like that, then we honor where they're coming from, and then help them to see that this potential for damage needs to be weighed against the known benefits.
Right.
And that's the path that's more substantial in its benefit. And same thing with cracking sidewalks or lifting sidewalks. Yeah, it might happen. Trees are, they're living creatures. You don't have the kid down the street, raised and assume that they're gonna, do bad things. It's like you have to, but sometimes they do.
Right.
Right. And so that knowing, what are these things that we have to address, and how widespread are they, and how can we direct our response in a way that that builds trust.
Mm-hmm. So in some ways, it was a little bit like starting off with your youth education work, or your earlier career with your social worker training, where it's like you're putting out surveys for people,
Mm-hmm.
and you're like doing a lot of listening and focusing in on the barriers to planting trees.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so much, I mean, it always comes back to that, is that you gotta listen.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. And in turn, you end up helping to produce like this big paper, which to me I think was, I don't know, I'm not in the field at all, but I have very much appreciated learning about it. So, yeah. Um, Thank you for that.
Thank you.
But
Thank Liz. No, we're very thankful to Liz for
yeah.
her work on that.
Yeah. Um, okay, you've mentioned, well, yeah, I mean, and I think that one of the anecdotes that people always think of when it comes to planting trees are, like, cracking the sidewalk, and whatnot. Um, this isn't really a great segue, but I wanted to ask if you had any anecdotes about tree tenders that you wanted to share. Um, yeah.
Mm. Well, there's a couple that I love. One is the, planting in South Philly where where there were two neighbors helping to plant a tree
Mhm.
that had never spoken to each other before, even though they lived across the street from each other for 10 years. And they planted a tree together. And you knew that as a result of that tree planting, their experience in their neighborhood changed. Because when they left their front door and they saw this person, it wasn't a stranger. They weren't alienated in their neighborhood, but they had a relationship. So that's one of my favorite stories. And another is, this is a funnier one. We have tree tender. We have, when people graduate, they get a tree tender card,
Mhm.
right? So, in South Philly, and another place right by, oh my gosh, what's the name of that street? Forget it. Doesn't matter. They were planting. There was a big tree planting in honor of the policemen in that district, and not somebody who had died, but in honor just of the police officers. And they did it strategically because they wanted the police officers to support the planting, and they said, so one of the leaders called me up one day and said that he had been out checking on his trees and doing some light pruning, and not one or two but three police cars pulled up to him, got out of the car, and said, "Show me your tree tender card."
Like your license at
Your
the bar.
license, license to carry a pruner.
Wow. Yeah, just to be clear, well, to maintain the trees, well, to plant the trees and whatnot, you need permission from the city of Philadelphia.
You need to plant a prune or remove a tree. You need a permit.
Okay.
But tree tenders have a card that allows them, and on their card it says that they're allowed to prune with both feet on the ground.
Nice. That's also an important stipulation.
Yeah, it's a very important one.
Yeah.
Mm.
Those are some great anecdotes. And yeah, I really like the one about bringing people together because I feel like that's a very, I don't know, because and I mean, yeah, to be fair, there, as you've mentioned, there are many reasons why people historically have distrusted trees in Philadelphia because of the relationship with gentrification.
It's not
But-
just it's not just distrusting the trees. It's distrusting the people offering the trees.
Right.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, in some scenarios like this, you can kind of see, trees can become kind of a vector for people to get closer to each other,
Mhm.
and for trust to be built. It's very sweet, but
Yeah.
I wanted to also ask, because you've given some great tree tenders anecdotes, but you've also, as you've been, managing tree tenders, working like kind of the organizational thrust and heft largely behind the program is with the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society. And I wanted to know if you had any anecdotes from working with PHS, working with people like Patricia Schreiber, or working with the tree department like Tim Eiffel, Dana Dentis, Shahan, Nashaleh, Bartley, like all these people. Do you have any anecdotes from that you'd like to share?
I think the one thing, what I will say is that the thing I'm most kind of proud of, happy about, I think is part of our success is that everyone on our team understands that tree tenders, even though they're working in their own community to better their own community, they're volunteers and they're putting in a lot of their own time and effort, and that they deserve as much support as we can give. So I think all of us would, if you get a call from somebody and it's like, regardless of when it is, if you can help them, you do. You put in the extra effort. It's not, I don't think anyone, I kid that I'm actually, when I had my son, almost 20 years ago, I went part-time. So I'm 4/5 time. I kid that, it's like, that means I'm working a 40-hour work week instead of a 60-hour work week. Because I get to do my volunteer time where I work. And I think everyone, there's no clock watchers on our team. And people are dedicated. And they're dedicated to both the volunteers and the trees, which is great. It just makes all the difference.
Yeah. Yeah, which is obviously really important to the nature of the whole decentralized education thing, is being just as committed to maintaining these relationships with volunteers as it is to pruning and planting and all of that. Yeah. And it shows in the numbers, because I remember the statistics that coming up when I was preparing for this interview were more than 6,000 alums of the Tree Tenders program. This was planting roughly 2,000 trees per year. This is the statistics that I think 2020 or thereabouts. So
this year it was 50. It was closer to 3,000. Close to 2,900 or something.
Wow.
And it's because they're honored. We have a tree tender committee that we set up a long, I don't know, maybe, 20 years ago. And the tree tender committee is a chance for any tree tender leader who's experienced who's experienced at planting and kind of stays on track most of the time. There's a couple that are that they can come and be heard. What's working, what's not working, what can we do better. At one point they helped to dictate changes in the class and what we taught, and I wasn't happy about that. I didn't want to give up having Audubon Society present at our class. But people felt that it was a great thing to have, but it wasn't as important. And and it was good. It was good to get that feedback, because the people who take the class, who are on the street, they have the best sense of what's needed.
Right. How did you develop that first committee?
Well, there was just, the people that we asked, people that were the most seasoned tree tender leaders.
Sorry, excuse me, clarifying. We as in royal we, or we as in?
The 20 years ago. I guess, it was probably, I never liked to do things alone. So I would, get Patricia to work with me on it, or Barley when she was here, or there was always somebody that, and if there wasn't, I would just, pick on poor Sally's. And Bushy's got great judgment. And, yeah, so it was, I don't think and I probably, contacted, like, maybe Mike Hardy, who was the president of UC Green. And he ended up, when I had my son and went on maternity leave, he came in and worked 10 hours a week and then stayed on part-time, helping with us. And there were always tree tenders that were really committed that I could call on and say, what should we do about this?
Right.
And people appreciate it when they're not, when they're asked for their input.
Right. From the very beginning, you kind of have this like you kind of get, a lot of people who get deeply invested, and then, you kind of develop that going, and then eventually it kind of builds into a committee as you, call them, talk to them, and like 10 years from starting, yeah, you have a committee structure that that has continued for the past like 20 or so years.
Yeah.
So all told, basically most of the big structural changes and correct me if, like, it sounds to me like many, like the tree tender formula, much like, I don't know, I want to say like a ginkgo tree, kind of a lot of the development happened, the really big changes you developed in the first 10 years of it being around, and since then you've been kind of refining the formula, which is really impressive if you think about it. Given
it has been refined a lot. And it keeps changing, and that's one of the things that keeps it young, keeps it vibrant.
Right.
But also, like every new class of tree tender coming in has its own characters, its own personality, and it's always slightly different.
Right.
Which is really nice.
Yeah. So, yeah, that brings us, I guess, to the present and even to the future, and that's exactly where I wanted to take us next in kind of wrapping up this interview. What are your future plans or future aspirations for tree tenders and work with BHS?
Yeah, so no one could have foreseen, the pandemic. And while I hate teaching on Zoom, there are benefits. And one of the benefits is that we can record all the classes and even record them and dub them in other languages, and then have them available. So one of the things we started doing this past year is contacting, where schools contact us and want to get involved. We've offered some of them the opportunity to teach to have the tree tender curriculum to use in their classroom. And that's really exciting to think if we can kind of make it prettier, bundle it better so that it's in 1 hour or 45-minute segments, and have this available for high schools, and they can get some kind of certificate at the end of it that they could use for a job with a landscaping company, or even when they're applying to college. And it would be really cool.
Right.
So I'm excited about that. Yeah, that's one thing.
I mean, that is a big thing, because historically you've really focused a lot, correct me if I'm wrong, but like my understanding is on adult education. And so this would be moving it into more of like a teen-focused area as well. And doing it with access to the technology, like, making full use of the technology that you've been forced to use due to the pandemic, like Zoom. And being able to dub it, like you said, also, like, that's another thing that you've mentioned a few times. Well, a few times it taking together the interviews with you that I've heard, and this interview talking about like Spanish-speaking neighborhoods, kind of like adding another level of outreach that you can do.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a organization we just bumped into at the flower show that called Seed Your Future, and they have like 9,000 teachers that they have contact for, and what they do is encourage kids to look at careers in horticulture. And so what if we were able to collaborate with them? And that's still in the works. That's like, a pie in the sky right now. But I just sent a copy of our class hub with the recordings to the organizer, and she was interested. I said, well, take a look at this, see if you can imagine some kind of fit. And
So you could help provide a certificate for like careers in arboriculture. Yeah.
Well, tree tender certificate that somebody who's interested in arboriculture could use.
Yeah. Very cool. Yeah, and it sounds like a great way to bring things forward and help out young people as well.
Yeah. And so much of a big priority of PHS is also the job training, job readiness.
Right. Yeah. So that's a big part of your future plans that you're excited about. And in the meantime, you will also be, of course, still teaching planting as many as 2,900 trees per year and doing those 3 times a year trainings.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I do them 3 times a year in Philly, and then there's 4 trainings a year in the counties.
Oh, right. We didn't even really touch on that aspect.
Yeah.
But
I don't do much work in the counties. I just kind of support my coworkers with that.
Mm-hmm.
But
and by coworkers, you're talking about the.
in this case, Dana and Ashley that do
Okay.
the county program, and Johanna and I do the city.
Okay. Good to know. Okay. And all in all, you've done, and also, so all in all, you're doing all of these things and, planting all these trees and providing all these environmental benefits and human benefits as well.
Mm-hmm.
And you're well set to continue doing that in the future. So, I don't feel like I need to insert that, but I wanted to wrap this up, and I wanted to do that by saying that I'm really grateful that I got to sit down and have this conversation with you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for taking the time for this interview, managing to, do it. So I'm going to turn off the recording now. Yeah.
Okay.
I pray we don't have any more recollections.
But wait, no, I'm kidding.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Now, I'll record her off.